The church hall was filled with whispers and muffled sobs as the funeral service carried on. Rows of guests, dressed in black, sat with solemn faces, exchanging glances and occasional murmurs. The air was thick with grief, yet there was an unspoken tension lingering beneath the surface. People had gathered to say their final goodbyes to a man who, in life, had been admired, respected, and perhaps feared by some. But amidst the sea of mourning faces, one person stood out. A frail, elderly black woman sitting quietly in the last row. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her worn-out purse, her eyes fixed on the casket at the front of the room. No one acknowledged her presence. Some even seemed to deliberately avoid looking in her direction, as if pretending she didn't exist. She had arrived alone without a familiar face to comfort her. No one offered her a seat closer to the family. No one whispered condolences in her ear. To them, she was just an uninvited guest, an outsider who had no business being there. But she knew better. She knew secrets, things that no one else in the room could even begin to imagine. And as she sat there, unnoticed and ignored, she silently counted the minutes. Because soon, very soon, they would all know the truth about the man inside the casket, the truth that would change everything. When the time came for guests to share their final words, a well-dressed man stood up first. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke about the deceased, a loving father, a generous friend, a devoted husband. The audience nodded along, a few guests dabbing at their eyes with tissues. One by one, others followed, painting a picture of a man who had lived a life of honor and kindness. But as the stories unfolded, the elderly woman's expression remained unreadable. She had heard these words before, sweet, rehearsed, and carefully crafted to preserve a legacy. But the man they spoke of was not the man she knew. And when the room finally fell silent, the officiant glanced around, asking if anyone else had something to say. There was a pause, a moment of stillness. Then slowly, the elderly woman stood up. For the first time, heads turned toward her. Some looked confused. Others exchanged curious glances. She cleared her throat, gripping the edge of the pew in front of her for support. Her voice was soft at first, but steady. I have something to say. The room fell even quieter, and then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. What she revealed next would leave everyone in shock. All eyes were on her. For the first time since she had walked into the funeral home, the elderly woman felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on her. Some guests looked puzzled, while others exchanged hushed whispers, wondering who she was and why she had decided to speak. The officiant hesitated for a moment before nodding, signaling her to continue. A heavy silence filled the room as she took a deep breath. Her voice, though quiet, carried a weight that demanded attention. I knew him, she said, her words measured. Maybe not in the way most of you did, but I knew him. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. The deceased had been well known, respected in the community. People thought they knew everything about his life, his successes, his kindness, his generosity. But the way this woman spoke, as if holding a secret no one else knew, made the room shift with unease. She took a slow step forward, her frail hands clutching the back of a chair for support. I remember the first time I met him, she continued. It was many, many years ago. He was just a boy then, a boy with a bright smile and eyes full of dreams. But he was also a boy who carried something heavy in his heart, something he never spoke of, not even to those closest to him. The guests watched, some leaning forward in their seats. A few exchanged nervous glances, as if fearing what would come next. A woman in the front row, her eyes red from crying, shifted uncomfortably. She was the widow, the grieving wife left behind. And yet, something about the way she gripped the edge of her seat suggested that she wasn't just mourning, she was anxious. The elderly woman's eyes flickered toward her for just a moment before she continued. He was not a bad man, she said carefully. He was a complicated one, a man who made choices that shaped the lives of others in ways many of you will never. No, the whispers grew louder. Someone in the back cleared their throat, uncomfortable with how the atmosphere had changed. This was supposed to be a celebration of a life well lived. But now the room felt heavier, like a truth long buried was about to surface. She let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "He carried regret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Deep regret." The widow tensed. A man, sitting beside her, perhaps a close friend of the deceased, shifted in his seat. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are," he said finally, his voice firm but polite. "But I think we should focus on honoring him today." She turned her eyes to him, holding his gaze with quiet intensity. "And what better way to honor him," she said, "than by telling the truth?" A heavy pause followed. The officiant glanced around, uncertain whether to step in. But something in the way the woman spoke made it impossible to stop her now. She exhaled, her grip on the chair tightening. "Years ago," she said, "he made a promise that changed everything. And I am the only one left who knows what it was." The widow's breath hitched. The guests sat frozen. Something was coming. Something none of them were ready for. And then, just as she was about to speak again, the doors at the back of the hall creaked open. A figure stepped inside. And, in that instant, everything changed. The heavy doors creaked as they slowly swung open. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance, eyes widening in shock as a tall figure stepped inside. The dim lighting cast long shadows, making it hard to make out the person's face at first. But as they moved closer, gasps rippled through. The crowd. It was a man they all thought they'd never see again. The widow's hands flew to her mouth, her face going pale. The guests murmured in disbelief, some clutching the arms of their chairs as if to steady themselves. The officiant, who had been standing silently at the podium, took a hesitant step back. The elderly woman's eyes remained fixed on the newcomer. She had been expecting this moment, and yet seeing him in the flesh still made her chest tighten. He stopped in the center of the aisle, his gaze locked onto the casket. His face was lined with years of hardship, his presence heavy with an unspoken history. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then, finally, he looked up, his voice rough but steady. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted. "But after hearing her speak, I knew I had to." The tension in the room was unbearable. Some guests sat frozen, others whispered frantically among themselves. Who was he? Why was he here? And what did he know? The elderly woman took a shaky breath. "It's time," she said softly. The man nodded, his eyes filled with something indescribable. Pain, regret, maybe even relief. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of people who had once known him. "I am his son," he said. A collective gasp filled the room. The widow visibly recoiled, clutching the edge of her chair. "That's not possible," someone muttered. But the man stood firm. "He was my father," he repeated, "but he never acknowledged me. Not in public, not to any of you. I was his secret." The silence was deafening. The guests looked to the widow, expecting her to deny it, to say it was a mistake. But she didn't. She sat there, her hands shaking, her lips pressed into a thin line. The elderly woman turned to the crowd. "Years ago, he made a promise," she said. "A promise to never speak of the child he had before he built his new life. A promise made out of fear, out of shame." She glanced at the widow, her expression unreadable. Out of love, perhaps. Tears welled in the man's eyes as he looked back at the casket. "I don't hate him," he whispered. I just wish he had chosen differently." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. People shifted in their seats, processing what they had just heard. The widow finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "He never stopped thinking about you," she admitted. "He never said it out loud, but I knew." The man let out a shaky breath, his body relaxing just slightly. It wasn't enough to erase the years of pain, but it was something. The elderly woman stepped forward and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "The past can't be changed," she said softly. "But maybe today is a start." The man nodded, swallowing hard. He turned back to the casket one last time, then stepped away, his shoulders a little lighter. The guests sat in stunned silence as the elderly woman quietly returned to her seat. The service continued, but now everything felt different. The truth had finally been spoken, and though it wouldn't erase the past, it had given the future a chance to begin.